So as David Miller indicated, we're going to begin with a discussion of why citations run off of runways. So we're going to start that by discussing how OEMs, the manufacturers of our aircraft, certify our landing performance, what goes into that, and what we can learn from how that is accomplished. This is a topic that has been particularly on the FAA's radar for the last 5 years. They've released a series of safety alerts for operators, informational publications, starting about, as I say, 5 years ago, that brought to the public's attention that a series of recent landing incidents and accidents had raised some concerns that the certification criteria was perhaps not sufficiently conservative. And in particular on wet runways, the braking coefficient that was experienced in these incidents was much lower than expected. This happened on both grooved and ungrooved runways and indicated that the traditional safety factor the FAA had used for years might be inadequate in certain conditions. So let's talk first at how these OEMs certify performance. When we look into our AFM for our official published landing distance, how is that number calculated? Well, the manufacturer goes out and validates their performance by having a test pilot fly actual approaches and landings. The test pilot crosses the runway threshold at exactly 50 feet and exactly VREF. It's important to understand that if the test pilot is not having their best day, they cross the threshold a little fast, they cross the threshold a little bit high. That data point doesn't have to be used. So this represents the very best, most accurate performance that a pilot considerably best in their field was able to accomplish. Once the pilot crosses the threshold at 50 feet, they bring the throttle to idle. They are allowed up to a 480 foot per minute descent rate and a 3.5 degree approach angle during the certification runs. So keep in mind a normal VASI or PAPI is typically set to 3 degrees. What this means is the test pilot may be touching down even before the 1,000 foot marks on these certification landings. So they touch down, they immediately lower the nose because within 1 second of the main gear touching down, the first stopping action can be applied. That is going to be full braking. That's the most effective stopping action that we have available in our jets. If we are flying an airplane, such as a Mustang that requires manual speed brake extension, such as a 525 that requires ground flap extension, then 1 second later after the main braking is applied, that action is performed by the certification pilot. If the OEM has decided to use that particular stopping aid in certification, and not all of our airplanes do utilize all of those available. So it's important to confirm with your own AFM. But in terms of the certification requirements, all that is required is 1 second after main wheels touch down that this process can begin. The test pilot uses maximum braking. And for our single pilot inherently certified airplanes, so our 510s and our 525s, that braking is done with new brakes and new tires. So achieving probably better stopping force than we are likely to achieve on our aircraft that has tires that might not be in the best new condition. And that number that the test pilot validates is what is called an unfactored landing distance. The FAA is very clear in saying that while the procedures used for determining these landing distances must be executable consistently by pilots of average skill, the number itself is not to be taken as representative of normal flight operations. All right, the FAA says this is a number that is reflecting a flight test environment, and that unfactored landing distance should not be in any way construed to be easily achievable or representative of a day-to-day normal flight operation. So let's look at the case of a light jet landing on a 4,000 foot long runway where the pilot has calculated that 3,000 feet is required according to the AFM. But this is a pilot who's not having their best day. This is not going to be an egregious, poor example of airmanship. This is just someone who is not achieving all of those test pilot parameters. So this pilot, instead of crossing the threshold exactly at VREF, crosses the threshold at VREF plus 5 knots. Well, there's a general rule of thumb which says that for every knot over VREF, we can expect to add 120 feet to our landing distance. So in this particular case, this pilot is going to experience an extra 600 feet of landing required. What if the pilot crosses the threshold a little bit high, 20 feet above threshold crossing height? Our nominal threshold crossing height is 50 feet. That's expected on a 3-degree descent to result in a touchdown 1,000 feet down the runway. From that, we can see that the ratio is 20 to 1. For every extra 10 feet high over nominal, we could expect to add 200 feet to our landing distance. So in this case, the pilot has crossed at 70 feet instead of 50 feet, 20 feet too high. They could expect that their landing is going to take an extra 400 feet. And finally, remember that the landing assumes the pilot touches down. 1 second later, the nose wheel is down and full braking is applied. Well, what if the pilot floats a little bit? What if the pilot takes a little longer to apply brakes than that 1 second? When we're traveling at 100 knots ground speed, that's roughly 170 feet per second that we're moving forward. So for every extra second that we spend floating or that we don't apply the brakes, we are traveling forward an extra 170 feet. So in this case, this pilot could expect they're going to use an extra 510 feet. Well, we could put that all together, okay? And this is not a grossly unstabilized approach, but this is certainly someone not having their best performance. They cross the threshold 5 knots too fast. They cross the threshold 20 feet too high. Maybe because of that extra kinetic energy, they spend a little more time floating than normal, and they take an extra couple of seconds after the main wheels touch down before they're able to lower the nose and apply full braking. When we add up those factors, we see that an extra 1,850 feet of runway beyond that AFM published distance of 3,000 feet is going to be required. In this case, that could result in the pilot going off the end of the runway and experiencing a runway excursion. For this reason, the concept of runway safety margins is critical. And the FAA requires this of 4 higher operations. Part 135, charter, and Part 121, scheduled airline, are required when they dispatch to an airport to calculate, generally speaking, there are some exceptions, that the aircraft be able to stop in 60% of the available landing distance. Another way to say that is, if the pilot looks at the required landing distance, they're required to have 67% more than that available. Those are 2 ways of saying the same mathematical relationship. If the runway is wet, then the pilot is required to know that they would have that required 1.67 landing factor, and then add to that an additional 15%. If we multiply 1.67 by 1.15, we end up with 1.92. So again, what the FAA is saying is when FAA dispatches a citation to a wet runway and it is being operated for hire, the FAA requires that there is 1.92 times the AFM dry landing distance for that operation. In our CJP SOPs, we have tried to capture those best practices, even though they're not required for Part 91 operations. We've tweaked them a little bit, and we say that we should use that 60% landing factor if there is no electronic or visual descent path indicators, such as a VASI or PAPI, or electronic, meaning a instrument approach or the ability to generate a synthetic visual glide slope. If there is, then we feel that it's okay to use an 80% safety factoring for most situations. We do have some exceptions in our SOPs for low time in type pilots. And we also, of course, recommend always that these SOPs just be a starting point. A pilot who has some time in type, but maybe hasn't been flying for the last several months, we're all going to be in that boat pretty soon, might want to operate to the more conservative 60% factoring. Certainly, there's a long list of other conditions, infamiliarity with the airport, nighttime conditions, all sorts of other conditions might result in us saying we want to operate with that more conservative safety factor. We also recommend that before every takeoff and landing, we calculate our performance data for that takeoff and landing, and operating in a conservative manner when it comes to winds. We don't want to take into account any benefit for headwinds. If we put in that we have 20 knots headwind because that's what the METAR is reporting, well, there's certainly a chance that at the moment we're executing our takeoff run, the wind could have swung 30 degrees off the runway. That extra 30 degrees could result in over half of that headwind component disappearing. Or maybe there was a gust and we happen to hit the lull as we're taking off. Likewise, if for some reason we need to take off with a tailwind, there are situations, one-way airports in the mountains, where the takeoff is going to almost always be executed downhill away from terrain, even if that means there's a tailwind. What we recommend is in that case, the pilot use a 10-knot tailwind component, the maximum allowable, even if they don't expect to have that much, because the same logic applies. The pilot might be expecting to only have 2 or 3 knots of tailwind component, but at that moment, they experience a gust that pushes the tailwind component a little bit higher. So important last concept is that when we are calculating, does our runway performance fall in the 60 or 80% of the available landing distance? Important we use the right number for that. And runway safety areas are a reason why that landing distance available, LDA, might not be what we would intuitively expect it to be. So we're gonna look at the case of Naples, Florida, a landing executed on runway 14. Runway 14 is about 5,000 feet long, and it has a very small displaced threshold, 100 feet or less. We might expect that in this case, we would look at the LDA, the landing distance available for 14, and see 4,900 feet or so. However, when we look in the chart supplement, we see for runway 14, the LDA is significantly lower than this, 4,400 feet. Well, why is that? What made that landing distance available be so much shorter? Well, the Jeppesen 10.9 chart has a subtle hint to that. If we look at runway 14, it publishes the same 4420 as the distance available. And it has this note that the last 450 feet of runway 14 is unavailable for landing distance computations. Why would it be unavailable for landing distance computations? Well, because of this concept of a runway safety area. Runway safety area is an area at the end of the runway designed to reduce the risk of damage to an airplane and its occupants in the event of an excursion on takeoff or landing. It begins at the runway end, and unless there is a EMAS installed, it is required to be 1,000 feet on. The idea being that the FAA has looked in 90% of runway excursions stop within 1,000 feet of the end of the runway. So the FAA says if we can ensure that there is nothing very hazardous in that 1,000 feet, no ditches, no hard surfaces, buildings to hit, then we are doing a lot to ensure the safety. The airplane might suffer some damage, but it is going to be a survivable incident. So in the case of Naples, if we measure 1,000 feet past the end of runway 14, what we see is a public access road. We certainly could expect vehicles on that road. That would absolutely present a hazard to the airplane should it travel off the end of the runway. So if the airport is not able to acquire the property to move the hazard, then the FAA requires them to measure back 1,000 feet from the hazard and treat any runway that falls in that 1,000-foot area as if it just wasn't there for these calculations. So as a result, it's critical that when we look at Naples, Florida, or any airport like this, we're using the right information. We would want to use the published LDA of just over 4,400 feet and ensure that our operation could be completed in 60 or 80% of that proper